Captain Midnight.
In my last video, I explained why I like Thor Ragnarok a lot more than the previous two Thor films. I think the film is a ton of fun, but if you notice, there was one aspect of it that I didn't touch on that much, the villain. And there was a good reason for that. When I think back on Ragnarok, basically none of my favorite moments from the film have anything to do with Hela or her plans on Asgard. Her motivation, conquest of the other realms, just isn't all that compelling. And sadly, this is a pretty common theme in Marvel movies. Where in the pages of the comics we have villains that are often even more interesting than the heroes they are facing off against, in the MCU, we are all too often stuck with a serviceable villain whose only real purpose is to move the plot along. In this video, I'm going to talk about my problems with Hela, and how they relate to other MCU villains, and then maybe make a few suggestions on how Marvel could fix its nearly decade-old villain problem. By the way, this video will have spoilers for Thor Ragnarok. So I had really high hopes for Hela. Great actress, creepy look, I was fully prepared to love the character going in. And then I just didn't. It's not that she ruined the movie or anything, it's just that she felt more like an obligation. Something to tick off the list, like evil bad guy who wants to conquer worlds, check, than a fully fleshed out character. While the segments of the movie on Sakaar are filled with unexpected twists and inventive new characters, things on Asgard just feel like they're there because Thor needs someone to punch really hard at the end of the movie. And what's so frustrating is that Hela and her plan could have been pretty interesting with just a few tweaks. Like, remember where she got that giant wolf thing that Hulk fights? Earlier in the movie, we see her resurrected, and a bunch of dead Asgardian warriors whose tomb has been hidden under the palace. It's pretty convenient for her, she has a whole army of battle-ready zombies right out of the gate. I'm not a fan of this though, because it takes away what could have been compelling about the Asgard plot. Instead of having yet another Marvel villain with a disposable army that our heroes can kill without having to deal with the moral implications of it, I'd have loved to see Thor have to fight some of his fellow Asgardians. We see the people of Asgard watch plays, hang out, scream, and run away, but we don't really get a sense of what their culture is like at all. Hela used to rule alongside Odin, right? And their reign had a lot of horrific bloodshed, but it also seemed to amass a ton of wealth and power for Asgard. Hela even goes out of her way to throw that in Thor's face. So it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to think that there's probably some Asgardians who thought that expanding their empire and power was actually a great part of their history and something that they should go back to. I mean, not to get all sociology 101 here, but I think that pretty much no matter how horrific or bloody certain parts of the past are, there will always be people who view them as the good old days and want to go back to them. I would have liked to see this play out on Asgard as well. Take Scourge. In the film, he seems to be the only Asgardian to side with Hela, basically betraying the realm until sacrificing himself for good in the film's climactic battle. I would have found him more interesting if he hadn't been alone, if instead he was one of many Asgardians who took Hela's side because they actually believed in her promise to take the realm back to its conquering roots. Like, Hela once led soldiers into battles and conquered worlds. She's creepy, yes, but she's also charismatic. Instead of basically showing up and saying, I'm gonna start taking over realms again and you all are just along for the ride, it would have been more interesting if she had inspired a segment of Asgard's population to rise up with her against Thor's family. Because here's the thing, magic powers aside, taking over other realms with no popular support from her own people doesn't seem like the best strategy, and ruling through a combination of fear and nostalgia for a bygone era seems a lot easier than just fear alone. Then the final battle would have been more of a civil war between those who stayed loyal to Odin's sons and those who bought into Hela's imperialistic vision, which in my opinion seems a lot more interesting than fighting yet another faceless horde army. And then, when the Asgardians get on the ship to find a new home at the end, Thor is the ruler of a divided, torn society. As the film says, Asgard is a people, not a place, so it would have been nice to get a better sense of who those people are.
Using his Viking power against evil.
These tweaks, at least in my opinion, could have made Hela a more three-dimensional character. But that just wasn't the focus of Ragnarok. The film seems much more interested in the dialogue and relationships of our heroes, and the villains just provide the basic skeleton of a story on which the movie hangs all the fun stuff. And I think it mostly works for Ragnarok, but so many Marvel movies have done it that the MCU now has a long history of villains being underserved. What the MCU has done so well through the years is give audiences who maybe would have never read a comic book reasons to care about their heroes. Starting with Iron Man, Marvel has, generally, been really great about introducing their leads, establishing what makes them different from other heroes, and getting audiences immediately on board. Understandably, this can often come at the expense of the villain, who especially in the superhero's first movie is usually just a dark reflection of the lead. But the sequels don't really have this excuse. We already know our leads and their world, so there was really no reason for, say, Malekith or Whiplash to be as boring as they were. Now I know what you may be saying, MCU movies aren't dark enough to have great villains. I've heard this a few places, and I just don't buy it. There's plenty of great comic book villains who aren't Heath Ledger's Joker, but are still very compelling. And while overall, I like the MCU movies a lot more than Fox's X-Men movies, I think there's a lot that could be learned from Magneto in those films. At his best, Magneto isn't a cackling supervillain. He's a man willing to do terrible things, sure, but his reasoning makes sense, and is a lot more nuanced than, I want to take over the world. Now, to be fair, not all MCU movies have this problem. In fact, in 2017, I would say there's been an improvement with both the Vulture and Ego being among the series' best, most interesting bad guys. And I hope that trend continues. I really enjoyed Thor Ragnarok, but I think the movie could have gone from really good to flat out great if Hela's Asgard scenes had as much thought and care put into them as the stuff on Sakaar. Because if you're gonna hire, an actual Oscar winner, you should probably give them material worth playing. And as a longtime fan of the comics, seeing villains not done nearly as well as they deserve is always a big disappointment. So as much as I liked Ragnarok, I still think there's a lot that Marvel could do to learn from the film's faults, and finally do justice to some of its classic villains. And with the MCU constantly evolving, I think there's reason to hope that they can do just that.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once, because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes.